Hello, everyone. I am Renato Cuocolo from the University of Salerno, and I thank the organizer of the course for the invitation to speak about radiomics in medical imaging, which is a very interesting topic. And we will try to go through these points within this lecture. Defining radiomics, which is more easily done probably by going through the typical steps in a radiomics pipeline, discussing or touching upon the relationship between radiomics and deep learning computer vision models, and then mentioning some of the issues in translating these techniques into clinical practice and taking a look at the current state of events. So what is radiomics? Essentially, radiomics is a definition which was established in 2012 and encompasses techniques that analyze medical images to convert them into high-dimensional data sets, which should contain information related to pathophysiology. And this kind of information is hidden to traditional qualitative assessment by radiologists and should be unlocked through this kind of computer-guided analysis. And essentially, radiomics is born out of the application of concepts behind other omics fields in medicine, such as metabolomics and proteomics and genomics, hypothesizing that we should be able to identify signatures hidden within the gray level values in our medical imaging exams, so in our pixels and our voxels. And these signatures are then valuable descriptors of pathology or different phenotypes within a pathology, and these can then help us in correctly managing our patients. And it is, however, important to note that quantitative image analysis predates the concept of radiomics. And this is the first paper I was able to identify explicitly mentioning texture analysis. And as you can see, it's from 1975. What has changed over the years is the digitalization of radiology and increased availability computing power, which has obviously greatly helped us develop these techniques and bring them to clinical practice. And these are all the steps that encompass or are comprised within our radiomics pipeline. As we can see, it can appear to be fairly complex, but it's easier than at first look once we go through these one by one. Segmentation is the first step, and this is essential because actually what we are doing with segmentation is provide the model with our ground truth. So in classical radiomics, we typically segment pixel by pixel, so what we can call a semantic segmentation of the image, and then assign a label to those to that region of interest. And in this process, we have to account for the data that we input to the model, so the imaging protocol details, what standards are followed, because as we mentioned throughout this talk, radiomics and the models built on radiomics are very sensitive to noise signatures in the images. We are often tied to the protocol or scanner, even the scanner vendor, for example, and technology, and this can obviously mislead the model and lead us to worse performance. But also, since segmentation is the ground truth or the information against which we train or at least assess the model, because we can also consider the case of models which do not use strong labels, such as the case for deep learning or foundation models, but we will still need labels to assess their performance. And so these labels need to be accurate and reliable, and we can test this especially when humans are involved in manual or semi-automated labeling processes. We should check the effect of different readers on the reliability of the model and of the data we extract from the images. But even with entirely automated processes, we need to check their accuracy and their reliability. We do not have to take these outputs blindly. These are some examples of segmentations. On the left, you can see a classical semantic segmentation that we can use for radiomics, image by image, producing finally a volumetric region of interest. On the right, you can see the segmentations produced by different deep learning networks for the prostate gland. Again, the need to check their performance and verify which one is more suitable to our needs and which is acceptable for our practice or intent. Then, once we have the images and their segmentation, we should preprocess the images before extracting any kind of information. And why is this important? Because it allows us to reduce the noise and improve comparability across scanners. Typical steps include spatial resampling. This is also important for deep learning because it ensures invariance in terms of the orientation of the image for the correctness of the extraction of the features, but also gray levels should be processed. We rarely should use the raw gray levels. This is a particular issue in radiomics where often this step can be forgotten. And these can be either normalized using mean and variance of the overall distribution or discretized with different approaches. And we will see that in the next slide. But also, as you can see on the right, we can also apply filters, and these again help us in enhancing the signal in the image, reducing the noise that we don't wish to keep. Regarding discretization, I just wish to highlight this because it has a nice visual representation of how these preprocessing steps can change the information that we wish to highlight within the image and how we should then take this into consideration when we are setting up our pipeline or assessing what the software does. For example, here we have two approaches. Both are perfectly valid, so there is no clear preference. On the top, you can see the effects of fixed bin number discretization. So we take the original images and we redistribute the gray levels, here represented actually in a red scale, to the same number of overall bins. And what this does, as you can see, is obviously change distribution, denoise the image, but also it reduces the difference in absolute intensity between image A and image B, while the fixed bin size discretization, as you can see, keeps the relative difference between image A and image B, while still reducing the overall number of gray levels based on how wide we decide the bins need to be. Why is this important? For example, if we are using a quantitative imaging technique, such as CT with uncertain units or PET with SUV values that we can see in the images here, then maybe we want to preserve the difference, the relative difference, because the absolute intensity of the gray levels has some actual value. While if we use different techniques which do not inherently have quantitative value assigned to gray levels, then maybe the first approach can be preferable to make images from different scanners and different protocols more comparable. Then, once we have our images or masks and the images have been correctly preprocessed, we can then move on to the actual extraction process. And here we can see that the feature extraction can be performed including different information. Then we have semantic features and clinical features as defined here. Definitions may vary, as you can see in literature. And these are essentially descriptors of what you're used to in clinical practice. So, for example, radiological descriptions or lab test results or other clinical information such as age, gender of the patient. And this data is not extracted directly from the images through the radiomics process itself, but can be very important to include in the models, even deep learning models, to make them more robust and more holistic, as this data obviously is not dependent, for example, on scanner or imaging protocol, and so helps us make the model more robust compared to this noise. And then we have what here is defined as agnostic images, and these are the proper radiomics descriptors, and we can break them down in different classes based also on the IBSI, on the standard IBSI definitions, shape features describing the morphology of the region of interest, first order statistics tied to the gray level distribution histogram, which, however, does not account for the spatial distribution of the values, but overall distribution within our region of interest or image. And then we have second-order descriptors or proper texture analysis features. And again, we can divide them in different categories, but the concept behind this is essentially that we use matrices or kernels, as you can see the example here on your right. We take the gray level values and we describe, for example, the frequency with which gray level values happen, or the homogeneity within their distribution, accounting for, however, their actual physical distribution within the image, which is the big difference with first-order statistics. And as mentioned briefly in the previous slide, these definitions, however, can vary greatly. Luckily, in the past years, we've had this large international effort, the Imaging Biomarker Standardization Initiative, which has worked very hard to provide standard definition for image quantitative biomarkers or proteomics features with the intent to provide greater reproducibility and standardization. And essentially, I would suggest always using IBSI compliant software to avoid issues in research or practice. Then we have our feature set. This can be very large, up to thousands of descriptors for each ROI or region of interest. And we now have to face some issues before we can go to the modeling phase, because we know that models are subject to the curse of dimensionality, so very high dimensional datasets are affected by sparsity unless we can pair them with very large data points, so with a very large number of patients. And this, unfortunately, is not obviously the case in medical imaging, where it's very expensive and challenging and not always actually feasible to collect very large patient populations. And so we need to employ feature selection or dimensionality reduction techniques. These, as we will see, can improve model performance, because we need to fight against the problem of over or underfitting the model. This can also be defined as bias-variance trade-off, and essentially, the more the model is resembling closely the training data, the worse it will perform on new data, because we can expect this to be slightly divergent from the training data. On the other side, a model that is underfit will not represent correctly neither the training nor the test data. So what are some of these feature selection techniques? We can see them listed here. Either we remove features because they're not useful or they're redundant. We can use classical statistics or even model-based feature selection. We will not go into much detail about that. But an alternative, and keep in mind that these techniques can be used in combination one another, are based on dimensionality reduction. In this case, what happens is that we use mathematical formulas and even deep learning models to project our data from a higher dimensional space to a lower dimensional one. And as you can see in the image on the left, this is a commonly used technique in other omics fields, such as genomics. And not only this reduces the feature dimensionality, but also affects the distribution and can help us identify better clusters or labels within our images that can then be used for the modeling process. Similarly, we can also process the radiomics features or general data themselves. And in this case, we are not removing features or changing the overall dimensionality, but we are changing maybe how the features values are distributed, or, for example, correcting issues in the data set. So, for example, for quantitative features, we can apply scaling, and this affects both radiomics and non-radiomics data. Or, for example, for non-radiomics data, we can impute missing values, or we can encode categorical variables. And again, in the example here, you can see how simply rescaling these features can provide a better representation and clearer division between the classes of interest. Then this is not entirely within the scope of the talk, so I will be very brief here, but I wish to underline this point because I think it's a very big issue that we're facing, limiting the translation of radiomics and AI in general into clinical practice. And it is the confusion between validation in different phases of the pipeline. And the term validation is often used to identify both phases of the, let's say, life cycle of a model, but this can be very confusing for users who are not very experienced in these topics. And essentially, the incorrect use of validation data can lead to information leakage. So the model will pick the test data and inflate its performance and lead to biased results, which we will then not be able to reproduce on new data. Essentially, the easiest way, I think, to envision this is envision the two different phases of model construction and define them as validation and testing rather than calling both validation. And so validation is when we need to test models or configuration or different models on our data to find the best solution for our problem, ideally. So we are taking our construction set or training data and then extracting a validation set or resampling multiple validation sets through cross-validation or bootstrapping. And the idea is then that we will test multiple times this data to find the best performing solution. But what happens is that then at the end of this process, we will not have a single model that will have been tested against actually new data, because every time we go back and change something in our pipeline, we are biasing our model based on the results of that test run. And this can be fine as long as we're constructing the model, but then we need some new data to then finally test the actual model. And this has to be data completely unseen during the process of constructing the model. And ideally from another source. This can also be performed with cross-validation, but nested cross-validation is very computationally expensive, and we still need to provide then a final model, and that final model will again need to be verified its performance against new data. So what about deep learning? And I think here there is another misconception that I wish to fight against a little bit. I believe that radiomics and computer vision are essentially deeply intertwined and two faces of the same medal, let's say, on the same coin, because deep neural networks, what do they actually do? The first layers of their network, they extract descriptors of the image, which are fairly similar, if not exactly, as radiomics descriptors. So shape or edge detection within the image, so define the shapes of the elements or the margins of the elements within the image. Then it extracts textual characteristics within the image, as we do in radiomics. And we can see the example here of what happens in the first layer of a neural network in different blocks. And then what happens that it extracts a large amount of parameters describing the images, and then it selects the most useful through the regularization process, which can happen again with different techniques, as with feature selection. And in the end, in both cases, what are we going to do? We are going to use the features that survive the selection and processing of the data to then build a model, which can be done with classical machine learning or within the last layers of the neural network. And there are differences, however, between these two approaches, because radiomics is inherently more variable, because as we have seen, we have many, many options for each of the steps within the pipeline, but at the same time, the pipeline is more transparent because at each step we can check what's going on and we have results that we can verify. And classical machine learning models, which are traditionally paired with classical radiomics or handcrafted radiomics, as we will see, are still very good performers on the amount of data that is typically available in medical imaging. On the other hand, deep learning does have some clear advantages over radiomics. It allows the use of weaker labels. For example, we do not need to provide accurate segmentations for the images if we have enough data. It automates large parts of the process of the radiomics pipeline, reducing variability and therefore also improving generalizability and reducing the need to rely on experts in the domain, which can also be costly, such as radiologists. So I think that radiomics actually has many different phases, and these combine traditional radiomics and deep learning in different manners. And we can see this in literature where we have, for example, radiomics features that are combined with deep learning networks and deep learning features to build a combined model, or we also have, for example, deep radiomics, where we have the features from the deep learning networks that are extracted from the network and then fed into a traditional radiomics pipeline. So we can call these approaches at the extremes handcrafted radiomics and end-to-end deep learning, with deep radiomics representing, let's say, a hybrid approach. But the solutions are very, very different, and you can find any of these in the literature. In practice, and we do not know for certain all the companies what is going on, but I would not be surprised if they also combine some of this information in some cases. So are we in a far west? Do we have some degree of consistency and standardization? What's going on? Actually, yes, as I said, with deep learning, often in medical imaging, we use pre-trained models, which are then fine-tuned on our data. So in that case, we do have established reference standards. And even for handcrafted radiomics, we have seen several efforts by major scientific societies, ESR, EOSOMI, RSNA, as you can see here, to provide clear guidelines to help researchers, and then so also the commercial companies, if we want to assess through research the performance of their models. And so regarding translation to clinical practice, we need now to touch upon the elephant in the room, I think. So we are still using this frame for levels of evidence established in 1991, and we know in medical imaging that we are generally limited to diagnostic performance and technical efficacy studies for practical reasons. And even within this domain in diagnostic studies, we can identify different levels of evidence provided by different kinds of studies. But what is the reality that we are actually facing? That in radiomics and AI in general, studies generally have low levels of evidence. Many, if not the majority, are retrospective. Very commonly, they are still single-center. Even when they are multi-center, they often lack external validation, mixing up all the data before the pipeline is constructed. And even meta-analysis, which are commonly a tool that we use in diagnostic imaging to have greater levels of evidence, are challenging to perform in the field of radiomics and AI due to the inherent heterogeneity of different models and the reliability, the reliance on data sources, which also makes the results of this meta-analysis in some cases questionable. We still don't know how reliable our traditional tools to analyze this data actually are. So what is the state of the art? Well, actually, even with all these challenges, we can see that there are many, many solutions available for clinical practice, almost 800 in the US in radiology, and over 200 in the EU. Last time I checked, very recently, on the available online registers. But at the same time, we can see that even radiologists in general are very interested in these tools. In Europe, 2024, almost 50% of respondents to the survey said that they currently use AI, and another 25% plan to do so in the near future. A survey from a few years ago in the US, similar results. A third of respondents actively use AI, another 20% plan to do so in the future. However, we can see that many of these respondents were not entirely happy with the performance of their AI tools. And why is that? Because essentially we are now in a bit of a transition period, because we can see lots of research coming out, because essentially research in radiomics and AI is very easy to conduct. We have the tools, they are fairly standardized, we have the guidelines. It's not hard for a research group to set up an AI or radiomics pipeline to analyze their images and provide new results. However, the translation of these models to clinical practice is very complex because we have to develop not only the model, but all the surrounding software tools. These have to meet strict regulatory demands, also in terms of consistency of results. And we also have to provide tools to monitor their use and performance over time, which is not as easy to do. And this all translates into costs, which are the main barrier, I think, to translation of radiomics and AI into clinical practice. The compliance regulations, especially in the EU, is becoming a bigger and bigger issue as regulatory demands tend to increase for AI in medical practice. They also require auditing and updating of the models, which obviously requires retraining and therefore costs to collect and retrain the models, to collect new data and retrain the models. We also have to provide training and retraining of the users, so the specialists who use the AI tools in clinical practice. We have to face the costs of integrating these tools within a very fragmented IT healthcare infrastructure, and we know how challenging that can be, even to get different hospitals to talk to each other and share data, let alone analyze and process it. And then we also have to acknowledge that the evidence overall is lacking, but also the evidence on return on investment and the economical side of things is even more lacking. And we do not have actual studies proving generally good return on investment, which then in turn makes it hard for us to justify this cost for taxpayers in public healthcare systems or patients and insurance companies in other healthcare systems. Therefore, I wish to conclude saying that I believe that essentially all quantitative image analysis tools that are used to build models that help us in their intention with clinical practice and clinical decision making should fall under the umbrella term of radiomics. And we have to acknowledge that radiomics is fairly new, even if it's been around for a decade. In practical terms, the evolution of the field has not yet allowed us to provide clear standards and sufficient evidence for widespread adoption in clinical practice. So it's a field that's still growing and still being established to this day and will be so for the next few years. But we also have to acknowledge, therefore, that while even today we have many solutions that are available for actually using clinical practice, there is still a big gap between the potential that we see in research, where we see all kinds of novel applications, and what is actually available in clinical practice, which is much narrower in scope, also due to the cost issues and regulatory issues mentioned before. For example, the most common applications are surely image reconstruction and very basic clinical decision support tools, which always have to be strictly monitored by human readers. And with this, I thank you for your attention and wish you a good continuation of the course. Goodbye.